want to build a truly inclusive culture. And we know that fostering an inclusive culture requires minimizing troublesome behavior in the workplace. So how do we do that? We start by looking at the causes. Problematic behavior can stem from several factors. In this module, we'll talk about two of them: snap judgments and bias. Let's start with snap judgments. Snap judgments refer to the conclusions we draw about others in the absence of full information. The assumptions that drive these judgments can be difficult to recognize, yet they shape the story we tell ourselves about why people do what they do. As an example, think about an interaction in an elevator. You get on at the second floor. Your coworker gets on the third floor. You greet your colleague, and he doesn't reply. What are some conclusions you might draw? Take a moment to write them down. Did your coworker remain silent because he's a jerk? It's certainly possible. Or maybe he's thinking about an upcoming meeting, feeling claustrophobic, having a bad day, or is simply lost in thought. Maybe he had a recent death in the family, or maybe he didn't hear you. If these sound far-fetched, that's the point. The number of possible explanations is practically infinite. So how do we know which it is in the absence of other information? The point of this thought experiment isn't to justify discourteous behavior in the workplace or anywhere else. If your coworker is regularly rude, reaching a negative conclusion about his intent on the elevator may be warranted. But without more information, it may be helpful to recognize that our initial conclusions aren't always accurate. The implications of drawing conclusions or making snap judgments without full information shouldn't be underestimated. Consider another example of where that can lead. There's a classic drawing of an elephant with a number of people standing around it, each focused on a different part of its body. In the drawing, each person is looking at a single part and is convinced of what they're seeing. One person looks only at the ear, convinced it's a fan. Another looks at the leg, certain that it's a tree. Yet another is looking at the tail, convinced it's a rope. Not one of them has adequate perspective to realize they're actually looking at an elephant. In other words, we don't always know that we're only seeing part of what's happening or that we're only considering some of the relevant information. Yet we draw conclusions anyway. Jumping to conclusions is a human tendency. We all do it. In part, we do it because it's easy. But snap judgments about behavior make it harder to create inclusive environments, and they build walls where we don't want them to be. Being aware of this impulse is an important step towards safeguarding against it. At the beginning of this module, we mentioned two factors. Snap judgments were one of them. The other is bias. Bias can be a significant source of challenging behavior in the workplace. But what do we mean by the term bias? While people vary in how they use this term, it often refers to the act of treating people differently, usually in a way that's unfair, based on preconceived notions about them. Those preconceived notions usually come from generalizations about the groups they belong to. Bias can be conscious or unconscious, and it can relate to a wide range of factors, including race, age, sex, and political orientation. Let's linger for a moment on the unconscious type, sometimes referred to as implicit bias. While unconscious bias is a topic of genuine concern, figuring out how to measure it in a way that predicts problematic behavior has been challenging. In other words, knowing a person's score on an implicit association test, a common way to measure implicit bias, tells us little about whether that person is going to behave in a discriminatory or troublesome manner. Given that disconnect, our focus here is on the behaviors themselves. What kinds of behaviors are we talking about? Sometimes they take the form of language derived from stereotypes. This can be comments about what people are good or bad at, or what they like or dislike based on assumptions that have nothing to do with who they are as individuals. Let's think through an example. Consider the following scenario. Two people are talking in the break room. James is Asian. Felicity is not. Both work in marketing. Felicity has found herself working on a problem that requires a level of mathematics higher than what she's familiar with. She turns to James and says, "Hey James, can you help me with this math problem?" Why does Felicity think James would be able to help her? Her comment may come from an assumption about Asians and math ability that's based on a stereotype. If this is the case, Felicity is not seeing James as an individual, and her comment is linked to that failure. The same problem emerges if you assume that an introverted colleague doesn't want to join a social gathering. In other words, stereotypes are not only based on identity groups. Stereotypes are tricky. Sometimes there's a kernel of truth to them. Sometimes there isn't. Regardless, they get in the way of our goal of treating people like individuals. And while we all sometimes make snap judgments about people based on what we think we know, it is something we can actively and consciously try to minimize. Because even if we prematurely judge someone in a positive manner, it's still not based on who they are. Remember that in the workplace, where interactions are usually going to be repeated, and where everyone has a common interest in building strong relationships, a commitment to seeing people as individuals builds trust and openness. Let's think through a couple of more points. We've said that a truly inclusive culture requires leaning away from seeing people simply as members of their groups, while also recognizing that those groups, especially when they reflect things like race, ethnicity, and gender, matter. Last, let's remember that open communication is always going to be key to engagement. While the earlier examples might seem clear in terms of what to say or what not to say, what if instead, for instance, you're talking about a coworker who's an observant Jew? Do you ask him to join you for Friday night drinks after work? Many observant Jews have a strict observance of Shabbat that begins at Friday at sundown. On the one hand, you want to treat him as an individual and not make him feel excluded. On the other hand, asking him if he'd like to go for drinks on Friday night might be seen as culturally insensitive. In the end, it's pretty much impossible to know what might upset someone, particularly when two people who appear similar in some ways have different responses to the same statement or question. This makes communication messy and complicated, but not impossible to navigate. We've described two potential challenges to an inclusive workplace: snap judgments and bias. With both of these in mind, when it comes to creating a culture of inclusion, we need to assume the best of our colleagues whenever possible. As we noted earlier, if you observe a comment or conduct that is inconsistent with your company's policies, it is important to follow any reporting obligations. But where possible, it is helpful to give others the benefit of the doubt, as we hope they will do for us.